Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on our third Google, I think it's the third or fourth Google Hangout that we've had ever since we started doing these Turn Down the Heat MOOCs. My name, first of all, would like to apologize for running a bit late. We had some technical issues, and we just need to clarify also that, you know, we would have liked to do the 1 hour, but we do need to stop on time, and we only have 45 minutes. So we're going to be very, very quick, but also hope that we can answer some of your questions. And for those who will not be able to answer your questions, we will definitely have them answered for you online. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Tambi Matambo, and I'm here with Kanta Kumari Rigo and Jagjit Sarin, both from the Climate Change Unit here in the World Bank. And based on what we've seen coming out of this particular MOOC, which is Turn Down the Heat from Client Science to Action, is that there's been 4 broad topics that have actually come out more prominent throughout the MOOC. And the broad topics today that we'll actually talk about in limited time is pretty much the Paris Agreement, the Bonn Conference. We've seen a lot of questions on multisectoral investment planning and what this means. And also there were several questions on climate information. How do countries actually access climate information going forward post-Paris? So your instructor, Kavita Surana, is actually monitoring questions that you'll be posting on Twitter and the discussion forum, and will share them with us, and we will try to answer as many as we can. So please remember to continue to post your questions using #LearnClimate, and somebody will definitely get back to you on them. So let me start with a very brief introduction. So, you know, we are very overwhelmed actually by the level of engagement and concern that you have for climate change. Thousands of you from 107 countries are actually taking this MOOC. And in this year, actually this third year, we've observed a major shift in the conversation, and the discussions reflect the evolving global conversation on climate change. And we all feel that the impacts of climate change, we know that it affects everyone, and we know that the need to act is urgent. We've also got this feedback from you. So let's start with the Paris Agreement, which sets the scene for all this. And Jagjit and Kanta are very knowledgeable on the current talks post-Paris and on the Paris Agreement itself. Kanta was actually on the ground in Bonn on the recent talks, and Jagjit was there actually at COP21. So what are your thoughts, I mean, on the Paris Agreement, and why was it a major milestone for you? We can start with Jagjit.
Sure. Well, thank you, and hello everyone again. Looking at Paris Agreement, one has to compare it with other climate agreements we had in the past, you know, starting with Convention, then Kyoto, and Cancun agreements, and which all culminated with a historic agreement we saw in Paris COP21. I would try to focus on these remarks primarily on what we achieved on adaptation, because this agreement is all-encompassing: mitigation, finance, technology, and the rest. But for our discussion purposes this morning, let's talk about what Paris Agreement has achieved in terms of adaptation. I think it's a reflective of growing awareness from the scientific community that adaptation should be addressed on equal basis as we address mitigation issues. So what Paris Agreement does, building on Cancun framework and all the rest, it brings a political parity and equal importance to adaptation implementation challenges in Paris Agreement. It makes it incumbent on international community, all the players, development finance community, local actors, sub-regional, regional, and it takes a very comprehensive approach to how we should address adaptation, looking at across ecosystems, cross-boundary issues, and you name it. So what it does, it provides a broad framework under which adaptation issues should be addressed at equal parity with mitigation. Then it reflects what is the case now and what should be the case on support for adaptation activities. It provides broad guidance on development finance communities, how they should incorporate adaptation and resilience issues in their financing. It calls upon contributor countries to enhance their support for these kind of actions in developing countries. And it encourages actors at all levels, from local, state, national, subnational, regional, and global level, to include adaptation concerns in all development policies. So in a way, first time international community has brought together a consensus text which gives a very strong impetus to adaptation action as we address the mitigation side of the challenge. I'll stop there, and probably Kanta would take a deeper dive at these issues.
Sure. Yeah, so let's talk about it in the context of bonds, since you were just to follow up.
Absolutely. Yes. I think to complement what Jagjit just said, it was very interesting for me when I was at the bond meetings last week to really get a sense of a positive feeling really at the convention. I wasn't in Paris, but I had been to the previous COPs. Here, I think, was a sort of an atmosphere of let's get down to business, let's get down to action. And I think that that word action was on the top of everybody's mind. How do we now get to the action, and action on the adaptation side as well? But I think just briefly, what I took away from the bond meetings was how much reference there was to the 1.5 degree target. So being even sort of more aggressive to say we really have to get to the 1.5 to really get the best out of development from the countries. And I think the other thing I took away was, I think, in implementing some of the agreements coming up from Paris, there were two streams of work. The technical examination process for mitigation and adaptation. I attended the one for adaptation, and it was clear, I think, that this is going to be a very important process. So I think I would urge all of you, I think, based on what you have learned from the book, from your experiences, to follow this process. What's going to happen is we had the kickoff of this technical examination process last week, which was focused on what I think you've been learning in the MOOC, the broad base. What do you do broadly for adaptation going forward on the institutional side, the policy side, the knowledge side, the climate services that we talk about, and multisectoral planning, for example. But what the following technical examination processes are going to do is they're going to have 20 of them in the next several years. They're going to take a deep dive on each of these technical issues to make them actionable and pragmatic, so that countries can really begin to do the right kind of adaptation planning and take their NDCs forward or their NAPs forward. So I think it's a really positive momentum, and I think we'll come back to some of these specific technical issues, but I want to say that there is a real wave of positive energy. And finally, I think the takeaway from the bond meeting was that the next COP, COP22, needs to be about action. We need to take the knowledge sharing and information and translate it to action. So, I think that's just where I'll leave the conversation right now, but to let you know that I think lots of interesting things are unfolding with a high level of momentum and energy.
Okay, thank you very much, Jagjit and Kanta. Those were very comprehensive comments, actually, on both Paris and also most recently Bonn. And then, I'd like to take it up from the word action, right, coming out of Bonn. And we got a lot of questions, actually, from our participants in the MOOC regarding planning, right? And there were questions on multisectoral investment planning. In countries, there's a lot of countries are talking about multi-sector investment planning, and this is also within the context of their NDCs. So, the NDC is definitely about mitigation, but we've seen a lot of adaptation as well in the NDCs. And I think multi-sector investment planning also implies that, there's mitigation and adaptation and trying to see where you can sort of gain some co-benefits from this type of investment planning. For instance, there was a question from somebody, I think in Ethiopia, who said in countries like Ethiopia, hydropower is the biggest source of energy, but then also at the same time, climate change affects also the availability of water for hydropower and also for agriculture. So you're seeing these cross-sectoral issues already coming in here. So the question, I think, for most of our participants is very much institutional, and they're asking, like, who needs to plan and consider these changes? Who should be involved? Is it just energy, water, agriculture? Is it ministries now, Ministry of Environment have also included and climate change towards the end. So, who should be involved in this, and what sort of platforms or organizational, institutional issues are there, and how can we sort of help countries think and act and on this challenge that they have right now? And I'd like to hear from both Jagjit and yourself, Kanta.
Maybe I can start off, Tanvi. One thing that I think that is really important is, I think, in terms of climate adaptation, I think one way to think about it, and this I think is a recurrent theme, it's really all of development. That's what makes it both really personal, because you're talking about development agenda from the local communities right down to a country's economy. It also makes it challenging, and that's, I think, the reality of why adaptation probably was a slow starter. But I think people have come to realize we have the Sustainable Development Goals. We're not going to achieve those if we don't develop in a climate resilient way, which is low carbon as well. And I think that is where, when you begin to think about development, we do have to think about it along sectoral lines. I think it's important to have the targets for health or the targets for agriculture, but very quickly you need to think about the interplay between sectors. And that's where I think, Tambi, comes down to the multisectoral, because what you do in one sector has impacts on another sector. So while a country wants to achieve food security and really, needs to look at agriculture, it really needs to look at the trade-offs with water demand. And very quickly, whether it's rain-fed agriculture or irrigated agriculture, you need to think about it. And then the next step you need to do, you think about your roads, your transportation for delivery of the food, that whether it's for domestic purposes or international, you begin to think of what is the access to those roads and the energy that you need probably to make those products more value added. And so it looks like development, but there is an additional layer you need to think about, because climate change imposes additional challenges and sometimes brings opportunities. So when you try to think about your agriculture, you may need to think about drought-tolerant varieties. You may need to think about spatially, certain areas may not be now the best to plant certain crops, and you need to have them, oriented in different ways. Again, I think roads, we know how often roads, particularly in a lot of the developing world, are very exposed to floods. And then when the accessibility is cut off, you have a challenge with the food delivery. So you need to think about how I make your roads more resilient, how you maybe have different diversions in times of when some of these risk and exposure are quite high. So it's really thinking with that climate lens embedded in it, thinking about the trade-offs, the synergies across sectors, and really this has to be led in a more systematic way. So when you say who has to do it, communities have to put in their inputs into what this means for them, what are some of their constraints, and the local government needs to then translate that into the district level action plans. We have a really good program in Zambia in the Barotse Basin, where really it's working with the communities to input into development plans at the district level that get then taken up at a national level through an interministerial committee on climate change, which has been funded by the pilot program for climate resilience, but it's really something that is owned by the government and they're scaling it up. I think that kind of bringing that into the district plan, looking at the trade-offs, but starting from the community, both bottom up and top down, I think it's really critical. And I think we have some good examples to share, some good things that we can build on to take this conversation forward. So don't hesitate, to look for these good examples or request us to share them with you.
Thank you, Kanta. So we've talked about action, we've talked about who should be leading this, it's very cross-sectoral, and but then there's also, I think, Jagjit, there's a question that says, okay, great, this should be happening, but then, there's a lot of questions about donor funding currently does not align with these ambitions. So would you like to sort of, make a few
Sure.
comments on that as well?
Sure. Well, again, as in my first remarks, I think we need to look at it in a bit of a comparative, where we started and where we are and where we have to go. If you just go back 10 years and see how much money was allocated for adaptation activities, for mitigation, then we saw a broad recognition that we need to provide more resources to get the sorts of multi-sectoral planning Kantas talked about and the investments. There was a shift in recognition as we have seen over the years, adaptation money has ramped up, not to the extent we want, but you saw that recognition at the policy allocation level in GCF, where they're talking about 50% allocation of the 10 billion they have to go to mitigation adaptation, which is a big shift in the kind of allocation parameters we have seen. That is having an impact across the board in climate finance architecture in terms of kinds of money we will see. The other piece of this puzzle is, should it be all resource transfers, or should it be linked to the kind of activities you're financing? So if it is, let's say, if it is an activity which generates revenue, would a recipient be palatable to receiving reimbursable sources? And we have seen different funds who have experimented this. PPCR is one case where countries really like the money, some very concessional, deeply concessional loans for the kind of activities which generate revenues. So that's another piece of it. The third piece where I sit in the Climate Investment Fund is you need to provide upfront grant support for the kind of activities that set the stage for these investment plans and set the stage for investments in the second stage, set the stage for deeper learning, monitoring, and reporting to draw lessons which those countries doing these activities can learn and also share across the board. There is a huge element of South-South learning in this. So one has to unpack this whole financing issue, the kind of financing, what kind of activities you're supporting, and how you learn these lessons, because it is about financing, but it is not all about financing. You need to look at it in a very holistic way. And things are improving. In run-up to Paris, we saw some kind of additional support provided to LDCF and a couple of other funds. Some other funds are in the process of planning, where they expect more money to come, like in PPCR, where 10 new countries have been added. They're working through the investment plan process, hoping to receive money. And we have to also look at this funding provided through bilateral channels. So we have to look at the whole spectrum of channels which are providing resources, and also mobilize domestic financing.
And yeah, that's what I was going to complement Jagjit's point. I think what we are seeing is some governments and public sector are beginning to take their own budgets very seriously and applying systematic methodologies like we have in Philippines and in other countries, where they're looking at their own budgets and saying what percentage of this is actually going to climate proofing or climate resilient development, and what is it costing them from their national budgets. Now, I think there are two things that come out of it. One is, I think, they're recognizing that there is an additional cost, and they want to understand what that is. But the second and more important thing is that they're recognizing also that they could perhaps reduce some of these costs if they planned differently.
Yes.
And planned in a better way and built certain capacities or did things upstream, ex ante instead of ex post. And I think that is also something that we really have to target, because that core development budgets and that governments are committing themselves to can be really reprogrammed or reoriented to be much more resilient, and also bring in, I think, the low carbon, right? So if you're building green buildings that are more resilient infrastructure, you can also make them green to have a more low carbon pathway. And we really should, be sort of excited about these opportunities. I want to draw everybody's attention, if you haven't seen, there is a TED video that Al Gore has put out, and I think one should really look at it, because he's talked about the positive aspects of real opportunities that are out there unleashing. We're talking about the public sector, but the private sector really is unleashing, whether it's solar power or whether other renewables that are going to catch on, just like cell phone technology caught on some years ago. So let's look at that as well. I think it'd be very important.
Okay, great. So there's a question here which says developing countries will mostly act on. There's two aspects here. They said low energy we take, and then forests and marine livelihoods. But what else can they do, developing countries, besides these two main issues that they're facing? Do you have any ideas, Jagjit or Kanta?
I mean, I think those are really important. I think the low energy, I think, one often hears about Africa, particularly, with its current development status, does not have to go and make the same mistakes that the rest of the world did. And there is a real opportunity to leapfrog into this low energy. It doesn't come without a cause. And as Jagjit said, I think we need to, make sure that there is sufficient funding to help with this transformation. So I think that is a really good point. So I think that low energy really is important, because remember, at the end of the day, if we don't have a cutoff on the level of global warming, we continue to be lagging. And even right now, I think you've learned in the course that we are caught, we are sort of, we're locked into a 1.5, and whatever happens, we have to adapt. But the faster we get to this low energy transformations, the better. And I think coming back to the forest and marine livelihoods, I think, all of these resources are really important, and they contribute to different economies, right? So you have countries that have forests, which have to look at these resources, manage them well. But the dryland forests are equally important in sub-Saharan Africa. Marine livelihoods, I think, does deserve a special attention, because I think for two reasons. One is we know how vulnerable the coastlines are going to be, and which is where a predominant amount of the world's population is. And oftentimes the poorest are also in those coastal areas, which is now subject to stronger storm surges and sea level rise. But the resource base, we know that, for example, the coral reefs will be threatened, and the fisheries, the domains in which the fishes move, all of these are changing. So we really need to help these communities and these economies that are reliant on this to plan and to plan ahead and to build the right kind of solution space, bringing green infrastructure like mangrove ecosystems together with grey infrastructure to manage the coastlines, to receive development. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and it needs to be done holistically. So I mean, there are lots of things that one can do. One can look at different countries. Each country obviously has different areas that they need to focus on. But I think those are things that make me think that there are some solutions, some challenges, but really things that we need to apply a longer term spatial and temporal dimension to making sure we are acting in a mode of preparedness.
Anything to add, Jagjit?
Well, maybe one issue or one area to add to what Kanta has already said is this whole urbanization in developing world. For the first time in history of mankind, we've seen this massive, if you can call it, migration from rural to urban. And we would have, for the first time in history again, more people living in urban and peri-urban areas than rural areas. And it's happening across sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, across the globe in developing world. And that leads to a huge pressure on the existing infrastructure assets we have and the newest infrastructure being built. And if they are not built in a climate resilient way, we are up for a major cost in very near future, where weather variability, excess rainfall, and the other impacts of climate change are going to hit this new infrastructure and the built infrastructure very hard. And for these populations who have just moved into urban areas and trying to settle, make their living, it's going to be extra burden on that. So urban poverty could really hit hard, very hard based on the climate change impacts you see and to be coming in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's one area, making infrastructure resilient, better planning, and downscaling the information we have for better decision making to address this climate impacts as building a new asset would be a key. And we have done some works for these smart cities or making them climate resilient, and we are trying to take it further deeper for peri-urban areas and the rest. And we stand ready to work with countries in that with tools and funding.
Yeah. And I think we started off with multisectoral planning, and I think there is no place where you call for multisectoral planning and then in cities.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
the municipal governments, the mayors, they really have to think along multisectorality, and they have to think along all levels of human development, because you have the urban poor and the slums to the sort of elite, and managing that is really, I think, where we need to focus a lot of our attention.
Well, thank you very much. I think those were both excellent responses to this question. And you've both touched on information. I heard knowledge. And in this MOOC, actually, we designed several exercises that provided resources for the participants to collect information and data so that they can understand their own local climate impacts. But then many participants, they noted that the data is actually not available for their locality and sometimes even for their country. So I think both of you, Kanta and Jagit, could you tell us more about your experiences and the importance of climate-informed decision-making? And do you have an example? Can you give them an example of how this helped?
Yeah, I think this is really sort of gets to the crux of the issue. I think if we're really talking about climate resilient development or even low carbon, there is a lot of things that are sort of positioned as that, but they are acting in the realm of low regrets measures and the low hanging fruits. I think we need to make that transformation to really the climate informed decision making. So I think the participants are right, and this came up a lot in Bonn last week, and this will be, I'm sure, one of the sort of focus areas under this technical examination process that they're going to apply, which is climate services, climate information, climate data, climate services. I think it's recognized that a lot of the developing countries have a dearth of data, right? They do not have sufficient coverage of observation networks. They don't have the sort of time series information that is required. But I think we also know that, we need to fill those gaps creatively. Today we have access to technology and satellite data that can really help us to fill these gaps and even sort of project backwards to understand projections forward. And I think it's how we bridge that gap in terms of bringing this Earth observation data to the countries. What came out clearly was lots of people have cell phones. We need to crowdsource and bring that information from the farmers and people in the field to provide input and then provide them back, not just information, but a service. So whether it's a service of early alerts to farmers or early warning systems on droughts, or it is, into city planners in terms of how you design customized, tailored information as climate services on storm drainage, flood management, So I think that is where we are heading to, and I think, but clearly this is a challenge not for one part of the institutions. We need to work with specialized agencies like the hydrometeorological agencies. We need to work with the end users, but we need to work with what you call boundary institutions that can help to translate data to information to service in a customized way so that the end user, be he the farmer, the fisher, the urban planner, has access to that information at the right time in the right place in the right form. And this has worked in places. In Uruguay, through a project with the World Bank and other players, including IRI and partners in New York, they've worked very closely with the agriculture sector to develop this customized information for the farmers. And there are several good examples, not enough. The FuseNet uses drought early warning system to make sure that farmers get their cash transfers and early information. But I think this is really where we need to step up our act. We need to go into forecast-based financing. We need to go into planned, resilient development so that we are using this information to get better development. But we should definitely focus on this area.
Yes. And I also would like to add that, these countries that are seriously thinking about multi-sector investment planning are, they're beginning to see these gaps and definitely trying to plan as well in terms of, getting information right down to the local levels as well. And Jagjeet, do you have anything else to add or?
No, I think she has covered it comprehensively. My overarching remark would be moving forward, the key factor which will decide whether it's development or maldevelopment is whether it's climate informed or not.
That's right.
So if you have that data and you have to work across the value chain, as Kanta has very detailed explanation, I think that's the key moving forward, and we have to put
the
in
only
resources.
thing I'd like to add to that, Judge, is I don't want to convey the fact that we have precise data and information. We are operating in the world of uncertainty and climate change, but we can understand what are the maximum or minimum number of options we have to manage those risks. How do we do decision making under uncertainty, which prepares us to not be maladapted, exactly as what Jagjeet was saying, but to make sure that we are progressing on the pathway to more resilient development trajectories.
The other side of this story is this whole insurance industry which is building up, and we've seen massive advances there, and also how it will fit in the social safety nets of the countries, how you bring it, whole resilience as a package. We've seen many private sector reinsurance insurance working with public sector institutions, meteorological institutes and the rest to build up that knowledge base and customize those services to meet their client needs. So I think we need to look at it in a very broad way and look at all the actors who are in this game and how they could interplay with each other.
So there's actually a really good question following up on that. There's a question that says, okay, whose responsibility is this, right? Is it, we've talked about government, is it big companies, is it small contributors, the different sectors. So is it the UNFCCC's responsibility, for instance? So maybe you could continue, you talked about insurance companies, so that's one aspect. So would you like to touch on this question?
Well, maybe I'll take a very kind of layman example. The way I have understood this issue is compare it with any other normal insurance product and road safety issue. Wearing a helmet in a developing country, when I was growing up, it was a real headache to wear a helmet. It didn't show off my hairstyle and all that, but there was a regulatory pressure to do it. There is a policeman checking on it, and there is an insurance product. And then availability of helmets. And then everybody started doing it.
Right.
So you could say, there was a regulatory move, there was an insurance product, and there was availability of product itself, which I could use readily. Take this example to the new climate world we're talking about. You need government to put in place right regulations.
Right.
You need insurance companies to bring in products which we could readily use. And you need to have that product to be readily used in terms of climate information, which I could use on a daily basis in a very easy way so that I don't have to go through modeling hoops and all that. And for a simple mind, and take it to agriculture sector. So if you are a farmer, as Kanda was saying, if on your mobile, you could feed in some data and receive customized information at a click, that's what you want.
Right.
And underplayed with or strengthened by government regulation and an incentive structure. I think that's the way to go, where different players in this game have to step up their responsibility. And at a certain level, it's an individual responsibility as well. You need to have the push and the pull. But I'm sure Kanta would have much more eloquent explanation.
I think it reminded me of the WDR report that the World Bank put out. I mean, it is a collective thing, and we had this sort of cliche, act differently. All of us have a different responsibility within that task. Act together. We have to be sort of active towards a common vision and act now because it's urgent. So it just reminded me of that cliche, but I think it holds true to this question and how we need to move forward.
Yes, definitely. So we're looking at the time, and we're coming towards the end of this Google Hangout, and I'd like to follow on. There's many actors who are responsible in making sure that, we tackle this problem collectively. But then, Kanta touched on you as well, the individual. What can you do? She said, act differently, reduce your carbon footprint, for instance, encourage others to act differently, and share what you learned in this MOOC, share your stories, make a really good video for your final product to inspire others to act. And also find ways to encourage your local government to act, right? I think we should really be thinking, there's of course the advocacy bit, but there's this also the collaboration bit with encouraging local governments and your government to actually act.
And urgently. It is really an issue of urgency.
Right. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jagjit and Kanta, and thank you very much for those who sent in some questions. I know we answered some and haven't been able to answer some. Definitely, you know, the MOOC is continuing, and there's Kavita and there's Alan Miller who will also be looking at your questions and trying to answer some of them as well. And, you know, this Hangout will actually be available for you on YouTube, right, later for those who haven't been able to attend the Google Hangout, and also for you to go back and, you know, maybe you want to use some of the stuff has been said here on your final project. So it will definitely be available for you. And I'd like to say thank you again to the participants, and, you know, please continue and finish the MOOC and get your certificate, and hopefully after the MOOC you have learned a lot more than what you already knew about climate change. And please encourage, you know, the various actors that, you know, you've heard about here or who you're working with yourselves on the ground to, you know, the urgency of this matter. Thank you very much, and thank you to our technical team and Kavita for helping us field the questions. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.